Beneath the falling snow of a quiet mountain town, a little girl carried her feverish baby brother through the night, begging for help that never came. Doors closed, voices turned cold, until a weary police officer and his loyal German shepherd stepped into her path, and everything began to change. What unfolded next was a fight not just for survival, but for family, courage, and hope reborn from ashes. Where are you watching this story from today? Leave me a comment below. I'd love to know. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss these powerful journeys, and may your day be filled with warmth, kindness, and unexpected blessings. The wind howled like a chorus of ghosts through the narrow streets of Timber Falls, a mountain town tucked into the shoulders of Montana. Snow fell in thick veils, coating the roofs and piling against the shutters of darkened houses. Lamps along Main Street flickered under the onslaught, their yellow halos struggling against the night. The hospital loomed at the end of the avenue, its concrete face pale under the storm's fury. A place that promised warmth and safety, yet often carried the bitter scent of bureaucracy and neglect. Through that icy storm stumbled a small figure, her frame no larger than a sparrow against the weight of the night. Lila Carter, 7 years old, thin to the bone, wrapped in nothing more than a threadbare wool coat 2 sizes too large, clutched a bundle close to her chest. Her tangled brown hair was soaked, plastered against her pale cheeks, and her eyes, once soft and hazel like autumn leaves, were now wide with desperation. Her lips were blue, cracked by cold and hunger, yet she whispered comfort over and over, as if words could keep her tiny brother alive. Inside the bundle lay Noah, only 8 months old, his baby skin fever red, his breath ragged and shallow. His small hands trembled against the frayed blanket, clawing weakly at the air, each gasp carrying the sound of an extinguishing flame. Lila's memories, though blurred by time and grief, returned with cruel clarity as she staggered toward the hospital doors. Once, not long ago, her world had smelled of apple pies cooling on the kitchen window and echoed with her father's laughter. Their modest wooden house had been filled with her mother's gentle humming as she sewed by the window. That warm life had been stolen in one violent night when fire consumed everything. Her father had tried to shield them, her mother had pushed her and Noah out a window with her final strength, and both parents were found still locked in each other's arms when the firefighters broke through. The image never left Lila's mind, and tonight, in the biting wind, she felt the same sense of loss threatening to take Noah too. Inside Timber Falls General Hospital, the night shift dragged on under fluorescent light. The hall smelled faintly of antiseptic and burnt coffee. Behind the reception desk sat Jennifer Ward, a nurse in her mid-30s with sharp features and tired gray eyes that once might have carried kindness but were now hardened by resentment. Her sandy blonde hair was tied in a tight bun, pulling the edges of her face taut, giving her the look of someone who believed control was all she had left. Years ago, Jennifer had been overlooked for a promotion she thought she deserved, and bitterness had sunk into her like ink in water. It made her efficient but cold, brisk but unyielding, and compassion became something she rationed like medicine during a shortage. The glass doors creaked open, and a blast of snow swept into the lobby, followed by Lila, stumbling. Inside, the girl fell to her knees, clutching Noah, her voice cracking as she called out, "Please! He's burning up! I need medicine. Please help." The hospital fell silent for a heartbeat. Jennifer looked up, her brows arching not with concern, but with annoyance, as if the storm had dragged filth straight into her clean white hall. She recognized the child instantly. "Well, if it isn't the Carter girl," she said, her voice carrying a scornful edge. "And the sick little parasite. What do you want now?" Lila hugged Noah tighter, her small arms shaking. "Auntie Jennifer, please. He can't breathe well. Just one pill, anything to make him better." The way she said auntie was timid, half hopeful, half afraid, as though the word itself might unlock some buried tenderness. But Jennifer's face only hardened further. She stood, the starch of her white uniform crisp in the light, and strode around the desk. Patients in the waiting area turned their heads curiously, sensing the drama unfolding. Jennifer leaned down, her perfume sharp with disinfectant and bitterness. She shoved Lila's thin shoulder, nearly making her drop Noah. "You listen to me," she hissed. "Even if you kneel here until sunrise, you'll get nothing. I told you before. You and that brat are nothing but burdens. If you want medicine, find money." Lila's knees buckled against the cold tile, and she lowered herself to the ground, Noah wailing weakly in her arms. Tears spilled down her cheeks, dropping onto his fevered forehead. The sound of her sobs echoed in the sterile corridor, yet no one moved. Jennifer straightened her back and announced to the bystanders, "This girl lives on welfare and drags her sick brother here like beggars. If anyone feels sorry for her, you take them home, because this hospital won't." Her words fell like shards of ice into the silence. At that very moment, the heavy rhythm of boots approached, steady and deliberate. The sound was accompanied by the soft jingle of a leash. Into the fluorescent light walked Officer Daniel Ward, a 42-year-old police sergeant known throughout Timber Falls. Daniel was tall, broad-shouldered, his once black hair now dark brown, streaked with gray at the temples. His storm gray eyes, often unreadable, carried the weight of both authority and sorrow. He wore the navy winter uniform of the local police department, his coat heavy with patches of snow. Years of service had sculpted him into a man who commanded respect without raising his voice. But behind his steady exterior was a wound that had never healed, the loss of his young daughter years earlier due to medical neglect. Since then, he had patrolled the town with a quiet intensity, protecting others while silently refusing to let anyone close enough to reopen his grief. Beside him trotted Ranger, his loyal German shepherd, 6 years old, with thick black and silver fur glistening with melted snow. Ranger was large, muscular, with amber eyes that seemed to pierce straight into a soul. A scar ran along his left flank from an old confrontation with a bear near the outskirts of town, and the story of that fight had become local legend. Despite his imposing presence, Ranger carried himself with calm discipline, trained not only to follow commands but to sense fear and danger before any human could. To Daniel, Ranger was more than a partner. He was family, a silent guardian who had shared his grief and never left his side. Daniel froze at the sight before him. A little girl collapsed on the floor, clutching a fever-stricken baby, and a nurse standing over her with arms crossed and disdain painted on her face. His jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, the memory of his own daughter flooded his mind. Her voice, her fever, the helplessness he had felt when no one came fast enough. Ranger let out a low growl, ears pricked, his eyes locked on Jennifer as if he too understood cruelty when he saw it. "Jennifer," Daniel said, his voice firm, cutting through the silence. "What's going on here?" His tone carried the weight of authority, but beneath it was a tremor of personal rage he fought to control. Jennifer stiffened, her face paling when she recognized not just a police officer, but Daniel Ward himself, the man she least wanted as a witness. She stammered, "Oh, Officer Ward, I was just explaining." Daniel ignored her and crouched beside Lila. Up close, he could see the hollowness in her cheeks, the raw redness around her eyes, and the trembling in her arms as she tried to hold Noah steady. His large hand, calloused from years of duty, rested gently on her small shoulder. "You're safe now," he said quietly. "Let me help." Lila looked up at him, her tear-streaked face illuminated by the sterile light above. For the first time in hours, her hazel eyes flickered with something fragile, hope. She clutched the hem of his coat, whispering, "Please, save my brother." Daniel's gaze shifted to Noah. The baby's heat radiated through the blanket, his breath shallow, his tiny fists opening and closing as though fighting invisible battles. Without hesitation, Daniel lifted Noah into his arms. The baby whimpered, his fevered skin burning against Daniel's chest. Daniel turned toward the emergency doors, his stride purposeful, Ranger trotting at his side like a shadow. Behind them, Jennifer stood frozen, her face draining of color as she realized her cruelty had been laid bare before the wrong man. Her composure cracked, fear trembling in her voice. But Daniel did not glance back. The storm still raged outside, but inside, for Lila, the first spark of salvation had appeared in the form of a police officer and his steadfast German shepherd. And so, the night that had begun with despair shifted course. Hope, though fragile and trembling, had found its way into the cold corridors of Timber Falls General Hospital. Snow continued to batter Timber Falls through the long hours of the night. the hospital's fluorescent lights standing stubborn against the storm outside. Officer Daniel Ward strode down the corridor, with the feverish infant pressed close to his chest, Ranger trotting at his side, each step echoing across the linoleum floor. Lila hurried behind, her small bare feet damp with melted snow, her hand clutching the corner of Daniel's heavy coat, as though it were a lifeline that might vanish if she let go. The emergency doors swung open, releasing a harsh flood of light. Inside, a young nurse named Emily Parker rushed forward. Emily was 26, her chestnut hair pulled back in a simple braid, strands escaping to frame a face that was both soft and worn from long shifts. Her pale green scrubs were rumpled, and dark circles clung beneath her eyes, but in those eyes lived a quiet determination. She had grown up in Timber Falls herself, the daughter of a coal miner who had died in a cave-in when she was 14. The sudden loss of her father and the exhaustion etched on her mother's face had planted in her an unshakable vow to never turn her back on those in need, no matter how heavy her own burdens. That vow now carried her across the room as she prepared a hospital bed with swift precision. "Set him here," Emily urged, her voice gentle but firm. Daniel laid Noah on the crisp sheets, the baby's skin glistening with fever sweat. Emily leaned in, her slender fingers checking the child's pulse, her brow furrowed as she read the monitors. "Severe fever. He's dehydrated too. We'll need fluids immediately." She snapped her gaze to another nurse lingering by the counter. "Get an IV kit." The other woman hesitated, glancing nervously toward the door, where Jennifer still lingered, arms crossed, her jaw tight. Emily's expression hardened. "Now." Ranger stood just inside the doorway, his amber eyes locked on the room, tail low but steady, as though understanding his role was to guard against any further cruelty. His ears twitched at every sound, yet his body remained still, like a sentinel sculpted from muscle and devotion. Lila climbed onto a stool near the bed, clutching Noah's hand, whispering soft encouragements. Daniel stood back, his broad shoulders casting a shadow across the sterile room, his storm-gray eyes fixed on the child, as if watching a battle unfold he could not join. For a moment, his mind betrayed him, pulling him back years ago to another fevered child, his daughter, Anna. She had been only 6 when pneumonia struck. Daniel had rushed her to a different hospital, 2 towns over, only to be told the staff was too overwhelmed to admit her immediately. Hours ticked away, and by the time help came, Anna's small chest had fallen silent. That night had broken him in ways no bullet or knife ever had. Since then, Daniel had walked Timber Falls with armor forged from duty, shielding his heart from the risk of loving again. But now, watching Lila fight to keep her brother alive, he felt the armor crack. Emily worked quickly, sliding the needle into Noah's tiny arm with practiced care. The 4th dripped life into him, while she cooled his forehead with damp cloths. Minutes stretched like hours until his breathing steadied, though the fever still clung stubbornly. "He'll make it," Emily whispered at last, brushing stray hair from her face. "He's fragile, but he'll make it because his sister refused to give up." She glanced at Lila with a soft smile, and for the first time in days the girl allowed herself a shaky exhale of relief. Meanwhile, in another part of Timber Falls, the apartment of Richard Thompson lay cloaked in the sour stench of alcohol. Richard, Lila's uncle, sat slumped in his recliner, his shirt stained with whiskey, his hair unkempt and matted with grease. At 40, his once strong frame had given way to sagging flesh, the consequence of years of drink and bitterness. His small eyes were perpetually bloodshot, his lips curled into a sneer at the world. To him, the children were nothing more than burdens attached to a welfare check. Losing them meant losing money. As the snow tapped against the cracked windows, he muttered curses to himself, smashing another empty bottle against the wall. His neighbors had long since stopped listening. Timber Falls was a town where people often chose silence over conflict, but even silence had grown heavy with unease. Back at the hospital, Jennifer returned to her desk, trying to gather the remnants of her authority. Yet the whispers spreading among patients and staff gnawed at her composure. She adjusted her bun with trembling fingers, her thoughts racing with fear of consequences. She had built her career on control and reputation, and Daniel Ward had seen her cruelty firsthand. Still, pride stiffened her spine. To admit fault was impossible. Instead, she plotted quietly, already imagining how she could twist the story to frame Daniel as overstepping his duty. Inside the emergency room, the storm of fear had settled into a fragile quiet. Daniel leaned against the wall, arms folded, watching the sleeping infant. Emily approached, lowering her voice. "He'll need close monitoring. We can't release him tonight, but—" She hesitated, her eyes flicking toward Jennifer's station. "Not everyone here believes in treating charity cases. Be careful," Daniel's jaw clenched. "No child is a charity case. Not while I'm standing here." Ranger let out a soft rumble of agreement, settling onto the floor at Lila's feet. The girl bent to pet his thick fur, her small fingers trembling as they sank into his warmth. Ranger leaned his great head against her knee, offering comfort no words could provide. Daniel crouched beside her, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You're safe, Lila. Noah's safe. I'll make sure of it." She looked up, at him, eyes red but glimmering with fragile hope, and nodded. The storm outside still raged, but in that small, sterile room, a different kind of storm, the one of despair, had begun to break apart. And so, through snow and shadows, the night carried them further into a tangled fate where past grief and present cruelty collided, and where the bond between a wounded policeman, a loyal German shepherd, and two fragile children had only just begun to form. The storm had thinned by dawn, leaving Timber Falls wrapped in silence, broken only by the occasional groan of snow sliding from rooftops. The streets were glazed with ice, and pale light filtered through the clouds, giving the town a muted, ghostly glow. Inside Timber Falls General, the emergency ward hummed with quiet activity. Noah slept at last, his fever breaking under the steady drip of IV fluids, while Lila, exhausted beyond her years, sat curled up in the chair beside him. Ranger lay at her feet, his black and silver coat catching the fluorescent glow, his chest rising and falling with deep, steady breaths. His presence was more than comfort. It was a wall of quiet strength, a living shield that told the little girl she was not alone. Officer Daniel Ward had not left the hospital through the night. He leaned against the doorframe with arms crossed, his storm-gray eyes softening whenever they lingered on Lila. She had fought like a soldier for her baby brother, and it stirred something deep in him, something he thought buried with his daughter. Emily Parker, the young nurse, entered the room carrying a tray of clean bandages and fresh blankets. Her chestnut braid brushed her shoulder as she moved with quiet efficiency. She gave Daniel a tired smile. "He's stable, but fragile. You should both get some rest." Daniel only nodded. He had slept through firefights before, but tonight, the thought of closing his eyes while the children needed protection was impossible. Beyond the sterile halls of the hospital, Richard Thompson's apartment seethed with anger. The man himself sat at his chipped kitchen table, another bottle already cracked open. Richard was a man of 40, whose once square jaw had softened under years of indulgence, his thinning hair matted with grease. His small, mean eyes squinted through the haze of drink, his anger a constant companion. He muttered about betrayal, about ungrateful brats who dared to humiliate him by running into the arms of strangers. His bitterness was not only about losing money, but about losing control, something he valued more than the children's lives. It was in this apartment that an old neighbor, Martha Green, watched and worried. Martha was a widow in her 70s, her back slightly bent, her hair a soft silver halo. She lived across the hall, and though she moved slowly with the help of a wooden cane, her eyes were sharp and her memory sharper. Martha had spent her younger years as a schoolteacher, known for her stern but fair demeanor, and the death of her husband years ago had left her in a small circle of solitude. Yet she never stopped noticing the world around her. She had heard too many crashes, too many shouts behind Richard's door, and too many nights when the thin cries of children echoed into the hallway. Fear of reprisal had kept her quiet, but last night, as she sat knitting by her window and saw Daniel Ward escorting the children into his cruiser, she felt a spark of relief she hadn't dared to hope for. Back in the hospital, Daniel took Emily aside. "I need to know what's been happening with those kids," he said, his voice low but edged with urgency. Emily hesitated, biting her lip. She had seen Lila before, bruises hidden under sleeves, shadows beneath her eyes. But Jennifer had always kept a tight grip on what was reported and what was buried. "There's been suspicion," Emily admitted, "but nothing ever put in writing. Jennifer would make sure of that. And Richard—" She trailed off, her expression tightening. "No one wants to cross him when he's drunk. He's dangerous." As if summoned by her words, the hospital doors banged open mid-morning. Richard staggered inside, snow crusted on his coat, his breath heavy with liquor. His presence drew disapproving looks from patients in the waiting room, but he ignored them, eyes narrowing when he spotted Daniel. "Officer Ward," he growled, voice hoarse. "You've got something that belongs to me." Daniel turned slowly, his frame towering compared to Richard's slouched bulk. "They're not property, Richard. They're children." His voice was even, but Ranger sensed the rising tension. The German shepherd stood, ears pricked, his amber gaze fixed on Richard, a low growl reverberating from deep within his chest. Richard sneered, though the sound wavered at the sight of Ranger's bared teeth. "You think you can play hero? But those kids are mine. State says so. I get the checks. You can't just take them." His words dripped with entitlement, as if money had ever equaled love. Before Daniel could respond, Martha Green entered the hospital. She had taken her time crossing the icy streets with her cane, but her presence was like a quiet thunderclap. Her face, lined by age, was steady with resolve. She approached the reception desk, where Jennifer watched with thinly veiled fury, and raised her voice enough to carry through the lobby. "That man," she said, pointing her cane at Richard, "has no business raising children. I've heard them cry night after night. I've seen bruises. I stayed silent too long. Not anymore." The room stilled. Patients looked up. Nurses glanced nervously, and Jennifer's cheeks flushed with a mixture of rage and fear. Richard blustered, shouting at Martha to mind her business, but her eyes did not flinch. For the first time in years, the fragile web of silence that had protected him began to unravel. Daniel stepped forward, his badge glinting under the fluorescent light. "You've been warned before, Richard. This time, there are witnesses. If you lay one more hand on those children, you'll answer for it." His words cut through Richard's protests like a blade. Jennifer slammed a folder on the desk, her voice sharp. "This is nonsense. Officer Ward is overstepping. He has no right—" But Emily interrupted, her soft voice carrying more weight than shouting ever could. "He has every right. Those children deserve better, and we all know it." She lifted her chin, her braids slipping loose, her green eyes burning with quiet defiance. It was the first time she had openly contradicted Jennifer, and the shock on Jennifer's face was plain. Lila, who had been clutching Noah in the hallway, peered out at the confrontation, her eyes widened at Martha's words, at Emily's defense, and at Daniel standing unmovable against her uncle's fury. For the first time since the fire that destroyed her home, she saw adults fighting not against her, but for her. She held Noah closer, her lips trembling into the faintest smile. The hospital staff shifted uneasily, whispers circling like leaves in wind. In Timber Falls, where reputation often outweighed truth, this was the first crack in the wall that had hidden Richard and Jennifer's cruelty. Daniel's gaze swept the room, his voice calm but resolute. "From this moment on, those children are not alone, and anyone who stands in the way of their safety will answer to me." Ranger moved forward, planting himself between Daniel and Richard, a silent barrier of fur and muscle. His amber eyes glowed under the lights, daring Richard to take a single step closer. Richard faltered, his bluster weakening under the weight of truth, witnesses, and the unyielding loyalty of a German shepherd who had chosen his side. The storm outside had quieted into flakes drifting like ash, but inside Timber Falls General, a new storm had begun. One that would not be silenced, one that promised change for two fragile lives, and perhaps even for the town itself. The morning after the storm dawned gray, the streets of Timber Falls still buried under mounds of ice and snow. The hospital sat like a fortress on the hill, its glass doors reflecting the pale sky. Inside, the tension from the night before lingered like smoke that refused to clear. The waiting area buzzed with whispers, patients and staff alike repeating the scene of Richard's drunken outburst, of Martha Green's trembling but firm testimony, of Officer Daniel Ward's unflinching stance. The quiet town, long used to secrets buried beneath layers of silence, had suddenly been forced to look. Jennifer Ward, the nurse whose cruelty had ignited the storm, sat stiff at the reception desk, her lips pressed into a thin line, eyes flicking with venom at every passerby. Her white uniform was immaculate, her sandy blonde hair pulled so tightly into its bun that it seemed to stretch her very face. But, beneath the surface, fear gnawed at her, though she cloaked it in disdain. She had been humiliated in public, and worse, in front of Daniel Ward, a man she despised for reasons she rarely admitted aloud. Years ago, Daniel had been the officer who reported her negligence in a different case, a report she barely escaped punishment for. That old resentment smoldered, and now it had found fuel. In the corridor outside Noah's room, Daniel leaned against the wall, exhaustion hidden behind his storm-gray eyes. Ranger sat beside him, alert but calm, his thick coat brushed to a muted shine by the light. The German shepherd's ears twitched at every sound, his amber gaze sweeping the hall. The dog had slept little, keeping watch through the night at the children's side, as though he too remembered the cries of a girl on a hospital floor. Emily Parker approached quietly, a clipboard tucked against her side. The young nurse's green eyes were softer now that Noah's fever had broken, though a shadow still lingered in her expression. "He's stable enough," she said, "but I worry. If Jennifer has her way, she'll twist this. She'll say you forced treatment without consent. She'll make it look like you crossed the line." Daniel exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. "I crossed the line between cruelty and decency. If that's a crime, then I'll take it." Ranger gave a low grunt, pressing his flank against Daniel's leg, as if echoing the sentiment. At that moment, another figure appeared. Dr. Samuel Carter, the senior physician of the hospital. He was a man in his early 50s, his once dark hair now a salt and pepper crown, his shoulders stooped from years spent leaning over charts and patients. His brown eyes, tired yet piercing, spoke of a man who had seen too many mistakes and carried them like ghosts. He had a reputation in Timber Falls for honesty, though his quiet nature often left him overlooked in hospital politics. Dressed in a worn white coat with faint coffee stains at the cuff, he carried himself with a humility that made him both respected and underestimated. He paused by Daniel, his gaze moving to Ranger, who sat still but watchful. "He's a fine dog," Carter said softly, his voice carrying the gravel of age. "You can tell loyalty when you see it." His eyes shifted to Daniel. "And loyalty is what those children need now. But loyalty can be dangerous when others have power." Daniel straightened, meeting the doctor's gaze. "And silence is worse." Carter gave a faint nod, as though he had expected nothing less. "Then be prepared. The hospital board will want explanations. Jennifer still has friends here. Not everyone values truth above reputation." Meanwhile, in the cafeteria downstairs, Martha Green sat alone at a corner table, her cane leaning against her chair. She had been persuaded to stay overnight for observation after slipping on ice that morning, though the bruise on her hip was minor compared to the storm she had stirred. Her knitting needles clicked as she worked on a scarf of deep red wool, the rhythm calming her nerves. Her lined face carried both fatigue and defiance. For decades she had watched injustice from her apartment door, the cries of children muffled by fear. Speaking out last night had cost her the little comfort silence had given, but she did not regret it. If anything, she felt lighter. A young orderly named Sarah Mason passed by and paused to check on her. Sarah was 23, tall and thin, with an earnest face framed by wavy dark hair. She had joined the hospital only 6 months ago, full of idealism, but quickly learned how whispers and hierarchy dictated survival. Still, her kind heart often betrayed her caution. "Are you all right, Mrs. Green?" she asked softly. Martha smiled faintly, her hands still busy with the scarf. "I've been all right for 70 years, dear. But those children, that's another matter." Sarah's eyes flicked nervously around the room before she leaned closer. "You did the right thing. More of us should have spoken sooner." Her words were quiet, but they carried weight, a sign that the silence in Timber Falls might finally be cracking. Upstairs, Daniel returned to Noah's room. Lila sat awake, despite her exhaustion, her small hand clasped around her brother's. She looked up at Daniel with hazel eyes that seemed older than her 7 years. Is he going to stay with me? She asked, her voice trembling between hope and fear. Daniel crouched beside her, Ranger settling at his other side. Yes, he said, his voice steady. He's safe now. And so are you. He wanted to believe it, though in his chest he knew battles still lay ahead. Jennifer appeared at the doorway, her expression taut, her voice sugar-coated but sharp beneath. Officer Ward, she said, the board has called for a review tomorrow morning. Until then, I suggest you remember that this is a hospital, not a police station. You can't stay here forever. Daniel met her gaze without blinking. I'll stay as long as those children need me. Ranger rose silently to his feet, his presence filling the space between them. Jennifer's face tightened before she turned sharply on her heel and strode down the corridor, her heels clicking like gunshots. Emily stepped in after her departure, sighing. She won't stop, Daniel. She'll fight tooth and nail. Daniel placed a hand on Ranger's neck, feeling the steady strength beneath the fur. Then she's not the only one with teeth. Outside the hospital's doorway, the storm had passed, but Timber Falls stood on the edge of a new reckoning. For the first time in years, truth had begun to slip through the cracks, and though danger waited in the shadows, so too did hope. The next morning, Timber Falls woke beneath a pale sun that glinted off sheets of ice, turning the streets into silver veins. The hospital loomed like a citadel above town, its windows flashing against the winter sky. Inside, the tension that had simmered since the storm now gathered weight, for the board of Timber Falls General had been summoned to review what had transpired the night before. In the main conference hall, long oak tables gleamed beneath harsh overhead lights. The board members filed in, their voices low, their eyes sharp with curiosity. Among them was Harold Whitcomb, the chairman, a man in his 60s with a commanding frame softened by years of comfort. His hair, thick and white, framed a face that was stern but not cruel, and his deep voice carried authority. Harold had served the town for decades, first as a doctor, then as an administrator, and while he valued reputation, he was known for weighing evidence carefully. Beside him sat Dr. Mary Ann Fletcher, a woman in her late 40s, tall and lean, with neatly pressed suits that spoke of discipline. Her hair, black streaked with gray, was always pinned into a French twist, and her glasses framed sharp blue eyes. She was a woman who demanded order, shaped by a career that began in the chaos of urban hospitals before she returned home to Timber Falls. Behind her, Reserve lay a history of losing her younger brother to untreated illness, a wound that had made her both fiercely protective of patient rights and merciless toward negligence. Other members included Father Thomas Avery, the town's priest invited as a community voice. He was a gentle man in his 70s, with thinning silver hair and soft brown eyes that seemed to see through anger into the pain beneath. Dressed in his simple black cassock, he carried the weight of many confessions, and his presence was meant to remind the board that medicine was not only science but also morality. Daniel Ward entered with Ranger at his side, the German shepherd's coat brushed to a sheen, his amber eyes sharp as they scanned the room. Murmurs rippled through the chamber at the sight of the dog, but Daniel did not flinch. Lila followed close behind, holding Noah wrapped in a clean blanket Emily had provided. The girl's hazel eyes flickered between fear and defiance as she clutched her brother. Emily walked with them, her braid trailing down her back, her chin raised in quiet courage despite the weight of her position as a junior nurse challenging authority. Jennifer was already seated near the front, her uniform pristine, her bun tighter than ever, as if every hair in place might prove her credibility. Her gray eyes darted toward the children, with something between contempt and unease. Richard sat a few chairs away, his shirt wrinkled, his breath faintly sour with the remnants of last night's whiskey. His eyes darted restlessly, shifting from Daniel to the board with the hunger of a man desperate to maintain control. Harold Whitcomb cleared his throat, and silence fell. We are here to discuss allegations of negligence and misconduct. Nurse Jennifer Ward has been accused of denying medical care to a child in need. Officer Ward has been accused of interfering with hospital procedure. Witnesses will be heard, evidence will be weighed, the truth will be sought. Jennifer rose, her back straight, her words practiced. She painted a story of intrusion, of an officer storming into her hospital, of a child who was not her responsibility. Her voice was steady, but beneath it trembled the fear of exposure. She spoke of regulations, of boundaries, of how Daniel had used force to obtain treatment. Richard leaned forward eagerly, supporting her tale, his words dripping with rehearsed outrage. Then Martha Green was brought forward. The elderly woman leaned heavily on her cane, her silver hair catching the light as she faced the board. Her voice, though quavering with age, carried the weight of truth. I lived across the hall from those children. I heard their cries, I saw their bruises, and I saw what Officer Ward did. He saved them when no one else would. The murmurs rose again, this time tinged with sympathy. Emily followed, her braids slipping loose as she spoke. I was there. Noah would not have survived without immediate care. Officer Ward did not interfere. He intervened when Jennifer refused. He chose compassion where she chose cruelty. Her voice shook at first, but grew steadier as she went on, the fire of conviction rising in her. Daniel himself stood last. His frame seemed even taller in the chamber, his storm-gray eyes fixed on the board. He spoke not as a policeman defending himself, but as a father who had once lost his own child to medical neglect. Years ago, I trusted a hospital to save my daughter, and bureaucracy delayed her care. I buried her because of that. When I saw this girl kneeling on the floor, begging for help, I swore it would not happen again. If that is misconduct, then I stand guilty. The room fell into heavy silence, broken only by Ranger's steady breathing at his side. Father Avery leaned forward, his gentle eyes sweeping the room. Compassion is not misconduct. It is the soul of healing. And if we forget that, we have no right to call ourselves guardians of the sick. Harold Whitcomb finally spoke, his deep voice measured. The evidence is clear. Nurse Jennifer Ward neglected her duty. Richard Thompson treated these children as property. Both will face further investigation. As for Officer Ward, he acted not against procedure, but against cruelty. This board will not condemn him for it. Jennifer's face drained of color, her composure shattering. Richard slammed a fist against the table, shouting protests. But the decision was final. Martha exhaled in relief. Emily's eyes shimmered with vindication, and Lila tightened her hold on Noah, whispering to him as though the words could become reality. We're safe. Ranger wagged his tail once, a subtle thump against the wooden floor, as though sealing the moment. The hearing adjourned, but Daniel knew the fight was not finished. Enemies humiliated often became more dangerous. Yet, as he walked out of the hall with the children and Ranger at his side, he felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest, not just duty, but the fragile beginnings of a family. Snow still clung to the edges of Timber Falls like a stubborn memory as Daniel Ward steered his cruiser toward the outskirts of town. The board's ruling had ended the worst of the storm, but the fight was far from finished. Richard had been silenced for now, Jennifer disgraced, yet Daniel knew the wounds of children did not heal with a verdict. They needed warmth, safety, a place where fear could loosen its grip. And so, he drove them home. The road wound upward into the pines, the tall trees dusted with frost. The house appeared after a bend, a modest log cabin built decades ago, its wood darkened with age, smoke curling from the stone chimney. It was not grand, but it carried a quiet strength. Daniel had built parts of it with his own hands years earlier, after the death of his wife and daughter, retreating into solitude. For years it had stood as a shelter for one man and one German shepherd. Now, for the first time, it would hold a family. Lila sat in the back seat, Noah asleep in her arms. Her hazel eyes widened as the cabin came into view, her small hand tightening around the blanket. She whispered, almost to herself, "It looks like a storybook." Ranger, riding shotgun with his head out the window, barked once, as if agreeing. When they entered, the cabin smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke. The living room was simple, a worn leather armchair near the fire, shelves lined with old police commendations and faded photographs, a rug worn thin by Ranger's pacing. On the mantel sat a framed picture of a little girl with braids, Anna, whose absence lingered in every corner. Daniel caught Lila's gaze drifting toward the photo, but said nothing. Some truths were not ready to be spoken. He led them inside. "You'll stay here now?" he said, voice gruff but steady. "This house is yours as much as mine." Lila nodded, clutching Noah closer. Her eyes darted from the fire to Ranger, then to Daniel, as though testing the edges of belief. The first challenge was simple: food. The cupboard held little more than canned beans, pasta, and a jar of peanut butter. Daniel muttered under his breath, unused to feeding anyone but himself and Ranger. He set a pot on the stove, awkward in the domestic role, until a knock came at the door. It was Martha Green, the elderly neighbor from across town, leaning on her cane but smiling despite the long trek through snow. She carried a basket wrapped in cloth. "You'll need this more than I do," she said. Inside were loaves of bread, apples, and jars of homemade jam. Martha's lined face softened when she looked at the children. "I taught half this town's kids. Now, I'll help with these two." She had lived alone too long, and in helping, she felt herself alive again. Another visitor came that evening, Sarah Mason, the young orderly from the hospital. She brought blankets and clothes she had gathered quietly from donations. Sarah, tall and thin, with wavy dark hair tucked under a knit cap, had known hunger in her own childhood after her father abandoned the family. That history made her sensitive to Lila's wary posture, and she spoke with a gentleness honed from her own scars. "They'll fit him better," she said, nodding toward Noah. "And you'll need something warm for her." Her eyes met Daniel's, an unspoken promise of support. Ranger inspected both visitors with the dignity of a sentry. He sniffed their hands, his amber eyes measuring intent, and once satisfied, he settled back by the fire. He had accepted them as allies. That night, after supper cobbled together from Martha's bread and Daniel's beans, Lila explored the cabin. She ran her small hand over the bookshelves, pausing at the old photographs of Daniel in uniform, medals pinned to his chest. She whispered, "You were a hero." Daniel, sitting nearby with Noah in his lap, answered softly, "Heroes don't live alone. I did what I had to. That's all." Later, when the fire dimmed and snow tapped against the window, Lila hesitated near the mantel. She looked up at the photograph of Anna. "Who's she?" she asked. Daniel's chest tightened. He had not spoken her name aloud in years. "My daughter," he said quietly. "She was about your age." Lila's eyes softened with a child's empathy. She did not press further, only reached out and placed her small hand on his arm. It was enough. Noah stirred, fussing until Daniel rocked him gently. For a man who had carried rifles and stood against violence, the weight of an infant in his arms was both foreign and familiar. Ranger rose, patted over, and rested his great head on Daniel's knee, eyes warm as if reminding him he was not alone. When Lila finally drifted to sleep on the couch, clutching a borrowed blanket, Daniel sat in the armchair, watching the flames flicker low. The house, once a refuge for silence, now pulsed with fragile life. Small breaths, soft whimpers, the steady thump of Ranger's tail. The grief that had haunted these walls still lingered, but it had been joined by something new. The beginning of hope. Outside, the pines whispered in the wind, and the snow gleamed under the moonlight. For the first time in years, Daniel Ward did not dread the night. He had brought 2 children home, and though the road ahead was uncertain, he felt the faint stirrings of family rising again from the ashes of loss. The snow along Timber Falls Main Street had turned to slush, brown at the edges where boots and wagon tires cut through. The little town looked deceptively calm, but beneath its surface, rumors spread faster than the winter thaw. People whispered about the board's decision, about Richard Thompson's drunken outburst, about Jennifer Ward's disgrace. Some sided with tradition. Family is family, no matter what. While others quietly admitted relief that someone had finally stood up for the Carter children. Inside his cabin in the pines, Daniel Ward tried to weave routine into fragile lives. Lila helped sweep the wooden floor with a broom almost taller than she was, humming softly to keep Noah calm in his cradle. Ranger padded behind her, his massive head occasionally nudging her arm, tail thumping against the walls as if approving her efforts. Daniel, at the kitchen counter, fumbled through the act of cooking eggs and toast, still learning how to share his space. The fire popped in the hearth, and for the first time in years, the cabin felt lived in. But peace rarely lasted long. Richard Thompson was far from finished. He sat in the corner booth of a dim tavern on the town's edge, the sour smell of whiskey soaked into his clothes. His face, rough and sagging, bore fresh bruises from a fall he didn't remember, and his watery eyes glimmered with bitterness. Across from him sat Carl Denton, a man known in Timber Falls for trouble. Carl, in his late 30s, tall but wiry, wore a stained denim jacket and had a permanent smirk etched into his unshaven face. His reputation as a brawler and petty thief preceded him, and his crooked nose bore evidence of many fights lost as much as won. "You want the kids back?" Carl drawled, swirling a glass of cheap beer. "Then you need pressure. Man like Ward, he won't bend unless you push hard." Richard slammed his fist against the table, nearly toppling the glass. "Those brats mean money, Carl. They're mine, and no cop's gonna take that away." His words slurred, but his intent was clear. Carl leaned in, his smirk deepening. "Then maybe it's time to remind Ward he's not untouchable." Back at the cabin, Martha Green arrived in the late morning with her cane and another basket, her cheeks flushed from the cold. The elderly teacher carried herself with dignity despite her bent frame, and she carried stories as easily as groceries. She fussed over Lila's tangled hair, muttering about brushes, then set to instructing Daniel on how to boil porridge properly. "A child needs 3 meals, not whatever a man remembers between patrol shifts," she scolded, though her eyes softened as she watched him try. Sarah Mason also stopped by that afternoon, her dark hair tucked beneath a wool cap, her tall figure bundled in a faded pea coat. She brought schoolbooks salvaged from the hospital donation box. "She'll need these soon," Sarah said, placing them gently in Lila's hands. Sarah's voice carried a note of longing. Her own education had ended abruptly when her father abandoned her family, forcing her to work young. That history had left her both cautious and fiercely protective of children who reminded her of herself. Lila looked up at her, shy but grateful, clutching the books as though they were treasures. While the cabin filled with the warmth of community, shadows lengthened in town. Jennifer Ward, no longer in her crisp uniform, sat at her sister's kitchen table. Out of uniform, her face seemed harsher, her lips thinner, her blonde hair falling in loose strands around her face. She had always built her identity around authority, and stripped of it, she felt naked. Her resentment festered into resolve. "Daniel thinks he's a savior," she muttered, staring at the frost-laced window. "But he'll see what happens when you embarrass someone who knows where the skeletons lie." That evening, Daniel returned from a brief patrol to find Lila, asleep by the fire, Noah nestled against her chest. Ranger lay sprawled protectively at their feet, his amber eyes half shut, but alert at every creak of the cabin. Daniel stood in the doorway, snow melting off his boots, and for a fleeting moment allowed himself to breathe. He had kept the children safe another day. Yet his instincts, honed from years of law enforcement, warned him this was only the calm before something broke. His suspicion proved right when Martha visited again, her cane tapping urgently on the wooden floor. "Richard was seen with Carl Denton," she warned, her eyes wide with concern. "And you know what that man's capable of." Daniel's jaw tightened, and Ranger rose with a low growl, as though he too understood. Lila stirred awake, her hazel eyes searching his face. "Is someone coming for us?" she whispered. Daniel crouched beside her, placing a steady hand on her small shoulder. "They might try," he admitted, "but they'll have to get through me first." "And Ranger?" The dog thumped his tail once, amber gaze fixed on the door. The snow had quieted outside, the pines whispering in the night wind, but within Timber Falls, a storm of men and motives gathered strength. Peace had touched the cabin, but its fragile walls now stood against a threat rising from anger, desperation, and revenge. Night settled heavily over Timber Falls, the kind of night where the cold sank into the marrow and silence stretched so deep it felt unnatural. In Daniel Ward's cabin, the fire burned low, shadows flickering across the log walls. Ranger lay at the foot of the couch, where Lila and Noah slept under a quilt, the German shepherd's ears twitching at every creak of wood and gust of wind. Daniel sat in the armchair with his service pistol holstered at his side, eyes half shut, but never truly resting. His instincts had sharpened since Martha's warning. Richard would not give up easily, and men like Carl Denton did not conspire without consequence. In town, Richard and Carl nursed cheap whiskey in the back of the tavern. Carl's wiry frame was hunched forward, his pale green eyes restless, darting like a man always hunting for an angle. A scar cut across his chin, the remnant of a knife fight years earlier, and his hands were calloused from odd jobs and brawls. He was dangerous not because of strength, but because of desperation. Richard, heavier and sloppier, leaned in close. "Tonight," he slurred, "we take them back. Ward thinks he can play daddy, but those brats are mine. You distract him, I'll grab the boy." Carl smirked, though doubt flickered in his eyes. He had no love for children, but he loved easy money, and Richard's promise of splitting the welfare checks was enough bait. While they plotted, Martha Green prepared another visit for the next morning. She sat in her small apartment knitting with trembling hands, thinking of Daniel's haunted eyes. Her long years as a teacher had taught her that children were not saved by verdicts alone. They needed protection every day. Though her joints ached, she resolved to bring her presence again to the cabin. "If I can be one more set of eyes, one more voice," she murmured, "then it's worth it." Back at the cabin, Daniel stirred when Ranger's ears pricked sharply. The dog rose silently, muscles tense, amber eyes fixed on the door. Daniel's hand slid to his holster, even before the knock came. Too loud, too insistent for a neighbor. He motioned to Ranger to stay low, then opened the door just enough to see Carl Denton standing there, his smirk illuminated by moonlight. "Evening, officer," Carl drawled. "Got a flat tire down the road. Thought maybe you could lend a hand." His tone was oily, forced casual. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "It's midnight. You've never asked me for help before." Ranger stepped forward, lips curling in a silent snarl. Carl's smirk faltered, but he pressed on. "Come on, Ward. A man can't leave his truck stranded." Daniel shut the door halfway. "Find someone else." But in that instant, a noise erupted near the back of the cabin, the sound of glass breaking. Richard had slipped through the rear window, stumbling inside with drunken determination. He lunged toward the cradle where Noah lay, muttering curses. But Lila woke instantly. Her hazel eyes went wide, and she screamed. Ranger exploded into motion, tearing past Daniel with a growl that rattled the walls. He slammed into Richard before the man's hand could reach the child, teeth bared inches from his throat. Richard froze, his face blanching at the dog's ferocity, the reek of whiskey mixing with fear. Daniel was already there, hauling Richard back by the collar, shoving him against the wall. "You think you can break into my home?" he roared, the storm gray of his eyes blazing. Lila clutched Noah, trembling but unhurt, while Ranger stood guard, teeth still gleaming. Carl shoved at the door, trying to force his way inside, but another figure appeared out of the dark, Sarah Mason. She had been walking back from a late shift, her tall frame bundled in her pea coat, when she heard the commotion. Her wavy dark hair tumbled loose as she rushed up the porch, gripping the iron poker she had carried from the tavern stove, where she stopped to warm herself. "Back off, Carl," she shouted, surprising even herself with the strength in her voice. Carl sneered, but the sight of Ranger's bared teeth and Daniel's drawn pistol made him hesitate. He spat at the snow and ran into the night, leaving Richard pinned against the cabin wall. Sarah stepped inside, breathless, her green eyes wide. I heard the glass. Are they safe?" Daniel gave a sharp nod. "Thanks to you." And Ranger Lila, still clutching Noah, looked at Sarah with newfound awe. "You saved us," she whispered. Sarah knelt, her tall frame folding awkwardly, and touched the girl's cheek. "No, sweetheart. You saved yourself when you screamed." Richard sputtered, trying to reclaim his bravado. "They're mine. You can't keep them from me." His words cut short when Daniel snapped cuffs around his wrists. "You're done, Richard. You're not a father. You're a drunk who treats children like paychecks. The law won't protect you this time." Ranger growled low, as if agreeing, while Richard sagged against the wall, defeated. The cabin was quiet again, except for Noah's soft cries. Daniel lifted the infant, rocking him gently, his broad shoulders trembling with the weight of the night. Lila clung to his side, her hazel eyes still wide, but burning with a trust she had never given so freely before. Sarah rose, brushing snow from her coat, and met Daniel's gaze. "You can't do this alone. Let us help you. Me, Martha, Emily, we'll stand with you." Daniel gave a weary nod, feeling something he hadn't in years, the strength of community standing behind him. When the sheriff's car finally pulled Richard away, the cabin settled back into stillness. The broken glass had been swept aside, the fire rekindled. Ranger lay once more at the children's feet, his body coiled but calm, his eyes still scanning the shadows. Daniel sat in the armchair, Noah in his arms, Lila asleep against his. Chest outside, the pines whispered under the moonlight. But inside the cabin, a fragile unity had grown, stronger for having survived the night. The snow had begun to melt, trickling into streams that wound through timber falls like silver threads. Winter was loosening its grip, though the air still carried the sharp bite of cold mornings. In the heart of town, the people who once whispered in corners now spoke openly. The events at Daniel Ward's cabin, the break-in, the confrontation, the courage of a German shepherd and a handful of neighbors, had become the story everyone told. And with each retelling, the tide shifted. The town that once stayed silent began to choose a side. At the sheriff's office, Richard Thompson sat slumped in a holding cell, his once belligerent tone replaced by muttering self-pity. Sheriff Cole, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a thick mustache and a reputation for fairness, stood outside the bars. Cole's deep brown eyes carried disappointment more than anger. He had known Richard since they were boys and had watched him slide deeper into drink and bitterness. "You had chances, Richard," Cole said quietly. "More than most men ever get. But you threw them all away. Those kids deserve better than your fists and your bottles." Richard said nothing, only buried his face in his hands. Back at the cabin, Daniel tried to restore order. The broken window had been patched with plywood, and the children went about their day as though they sensed the worst had passed. Lila sat cross-legged on the rug, tracing letters in the schoolbook Sarah had brought, while Noah gurgled beside her, fascinated by Ranger's tail swishing rhythmically across the floor. The German shepherd seemed proud of his role, his amber eyes watchful, his black and silver coat gleaming in the firelight. Every so often, he leaned over to nudge Noah gently, eliciting a squeal of laughter that filled the cabin with warmth. Sarah Mason returned that afternoon, tall and composed despite the fatigue from long hospital shifts. Her dark hair was tucked neatly under a wool scarf, and her green eyes lit up at the sight of Lila reading aloud. She knelt beside the girl, correcting her softly when she stumbled over words. Teaching came naturally to Sarah. It was the dream she had abandoned when her family fell apart. Now, helping Lila reignited that spark. "You're clever," she told her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You'll learn faster than you think." Lila's cheeks flushed with pride, and for a moment, the girl who had once trembled on cold tiles looked every bit the student she should have always been. Later that week, the townspeople gathered at the church hall, its wooden beams strung with lanterns that swayed in the draft. Father Thomas Avery presided, his cassock simple, his soft brown eyes steady as he called the meeting to order. The priest had seen Timber Falls through births and funerals, weddings and disputes, but rarely had he seen it stirred like this. The hall was filled with farmers in flannel, mothers with children on their laps, and elders wrapped in shawls. They came not for ritual, but for decision. Emily Parker spoke first, her chestnut braid slipping loose as she stood nervously before the crowd. Her green eyes glowed with conviction. "I was there that night. Noah would not have survived without help. Officer Ward did what was right, even when others failed. We cannot allow cruelty to hide behind family ties or hospital walls any longer." Her words trembled, but the silence that followed was respectful, even reverent. Martha Green rose next, leaning heavily on her cane. The lantern light caught her silver hair, and her lined face shone with quiet strength. "I stayed silent for too long. I heard those children cry through my walls, and I was afraid. Afraid of causing trouble, afraid of being alone, but that silence nearly cost them their lives. Officer Ward stood where the rest of us did not, and now it's our turn to stand with him." She sat to a ripple of murmurs, the sound of agreement building. Sheriff Cole then addressed the hall, his deep voice cutting through the air. "The law will deal with Richard, but law alone doesn't raise children. Community does, and we must decide if these children will remain alone or if we will help build them a home." His words were simple, but struck deep. The meeting ended with no vote, but with something stronger, a consensus. People pressed forward to Daniel, offering clothes, food, and even labor to repair the cabin. For a man used to shouldering burdens alone, the flood of kindness was overwhelming. Lila clung to his side, eyes wide at the sight of strangers smiling at her instead of sneering. Noah cooed in Ranger's arms, the big dog allowing the infant to clutch his ear without complaint. That evening, back at the cabin, Daniel lit the fire brighter than usual. The children ate stew made from vegetables donated at the hall. Sarah sat by the hearth, reading aloud to Lila, while Martha dozed in the armchair, her cane resting against the wall. Emily arrived later, carrying jars of preserves and medical supplies. Ranger patrolled between them all, his tail swaying, his body relaxed but ready. For the first time in years, laughter filled the cabin, not forced or fleeting, but genuine. Lila giggled when Noah splashed stew with his tiny hands. Sarah teased Daniel about his clumsy cooking, and Emily's laughter mingled with Martha's stories of school days past. Daniel sat quietly amid it all, his storm-gray eyes softening as he realized the cabin no longer echoed with ghosts alone. It now rang with life. When the children were tucked into bed, Daniel stepped outside into the cold night. The stars shone fiercely over the pines, and the air was sharp with pine resin and melting snow. Ranger sat beside him, gaze fixed on the dark woods. Daniel rested a hand on the dog's thick fur, whispering, "We're not alone anymore." For the first time since his daughter's death, he believed it. The fight was not over. Jennifer still nursed her resentment. Richard still wallowed in anger, and shadows lingered. But in that cabin, on that night, Lila and Noah had found more than safety. They had found a family. And Timber Falls, once content with silence, had begun to find its voice. In the end, this story reminds us that God's miracles often arrive in the quietest ways, through the courage of a child, the loyalty of a dog, or the compassion of a weary man who chooses to love again. Just as the Lord never abandons his children, we are called each day to open our doors, soften our hearts, and be the miracle someone else is praying for. If this story touched your heart, please share it so others may find hope. Leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. And if you believe in God's blessings, type Amen in the comments. Do not forget to subscribe for more stories of faith, love, and redemption. May the Lord bless you and your family today and always.